You are about to witness the unraveling of a mind that was once the throne of God. Wait to see how the silence of heaven can transform into the most deafening scream of the human soul. Stay with us for the autopsy of Saul's paranoia and discover what happens when a man tries to govern what the Spirit has abandoned. Do not miss the moment when the first king of Israel crawls through the shadows in search of a forbidden voice. This is the Bible teaches. The oil that once flowed down Saul's beard, perfumed with rare spices and sealed by an eternal promise, now seems to have transformed into a cold, sticky residue weighing down his weary eyelids. The palace of Gibeah no longer echoes with songs of victory, but with the dry sound of sandals dragging across rough stone floors during nights of absolute insomnia. For years, the certainty that the Creator walked beside him was the foundation that kept his broad shoulders upright before Philistine armies. But that invisible structure began to crack, and no one noticed the first snap. The torchlight on the stone walls casts long shadows that seem to take on a life of their own, writhing like serpents, whispering doubts the king can no longer silence. The weight of the golden crown is no longer a symbol of authority, but a metal ring tightening around the temples of a man who smells his own sweat mixed with the fear of the void. The silence coming from the tabernacle is no longer a reverent peace, but a hostile vacuum that consumes every prayer cast toward the ceiling, returning only the echo of a voice that heaven seems to have decided to forget. Saul stretches out trembling fingers to touch the cold wall, seeking any solidity in a world that has begun to unravel from within, where the divine presence has been replaced by an icy wind blowing through the corridors of the mind. The man chosen from among thousands to lead a nation now finds himself unable to lead his own thoughts, which flee like deserting soldiers before a lost battle. He does not yet know it, but the anomaly beginning to devour his peace is the price of keeping the throne, while his heart has already become a desert of autonomy and pride. To understand the abyss where Saul finds himself, we must look at the hands that now tremble beneath the royal robe, remembering they were once the hands of a peasant boy who sought only his father's lost donkeys. The contrast is violent. The man who hid among the baggage on the day of his coronation, moved by an almost childlike humility, has been replaced by a figure clinging to the scepter as if gold could fill the hole left by the withdrawal of the Spirit. Israel's macro history was shifting from a government of judges to a centralized monarchy, but at the micro level, Saul was losing the war against his own ego. The air in Gibeah feels denser today, heavy with the scent of burnt incense that does not rise but crawls along the floor like a heavy gray fog. Saul walks to the window of his palace and observes the hills of Benjamin, remembering the moment Samuel poured the oil over his head and the world seemed to take on colors he had never seen before. In those days, heaven was an open door, and the voice of God was a clear whisper in his chest. But now, every decision feels like a blind walk through a field of thorns, where every step tears a little more of his sanity. The psychology of this collapse lies in the transition from dependence to self-sufficiency. Saul stopped consulting the prophet because he began to believe his own sword was enough to maintain Israel's borders. The evil spirit mentioned in Scripture begins to manifest here, not just as an invading force, but as the chronic anxiety of one who knows he is faking an authority that heaven has already revoked. The king looks at his reflection in a polished bronze basin and does not recognize the bloodshot eyes and the forehead furrowed by worries no military strategy can solve. Feeling the first chill of one who realizes that the throne has become his loneliest prison, the wind blowing through the valley of Gilgal brings with it the smell of dry earth and the sour sweat of thousands of soldiers who, camped among the rocks, ye begin to feel the metallic taste of fear. Saul watches his men desert through the mountain crevices, vanishing like shadows among the acacia bushes, while the seventh day, the deadline established by Samuel, expires under a sun that burns the skin and cracks the soil. The external pressure of a Philistine army ready for slaughter meets the internal pressure of a king who cannot bear the weight of silence. Every minute of waiting is a drop of acid corroding his trust in God's sovereignty. The king paces back and forth, his leather boots beating rhythmically against the stone, a sound that echoes the racing beat of a heart that stopped trusting and started controlling. He looks at the stone altar, at the piled wood, and the sacrifice that waits, feeling an urgency born not of faith, but of the panic of being abandoned by military luck. In an impulsive gesture, he reaches out for what does not belong to him, profaning the sacred to try and secure the secular, and the moment the first flame consumes the animal's fat, he feels a sudden chill in his bones that no altar fire can warm. It was there, amid the black smoke and the stern gaze of Samuel appearing on the horizon like a messenger of judgment, that the anomaly settled in for good. The conviction that he could keep God's blessings without God's obedience. Samuel brings no words of comfort, but a sentence that sounds like the slamming of a heavy bronze door, announcing that the kingdom has been torn from his hands. Something began to crumble in the foundations of Saul's soul at that instant, and as the prophet turned his back, the king remained static, his hands stained with ash, and the silence of God becoming, for the first time, a terrifying presence. The vacuum left by the withdrawal of the Spirit of God did not remain empty for long. In its place settled a dense presence, a melancholy that clung to Saul's entrails like an invisible parasite. It was not just an ordinary sadness, but an evil spirit that brought with it the stench of ash and a vision of enemies where there were only shadows. The king, once a firm-footed warrior, now spent hours in a catatonic state, eyes fixed on nothing, while cold sweat trickled down his forehead, clearing furrows in the dust on his face. His mind became a battlefield where he had already surrendered, and the only thing that interrupted his fits of terror was the sound of a harp coming from a young shepherd of Bethlehem. As David enters the royal chamber, bringing with him the smell of fresh grass and sheep's wool, an absolute contrast to the stagnant and heavy air of the palace. While the young man's fingers run across the sheep gut strings, the music acts as a temporary balm, pushing the shadows into the darkest corners of the room. Saul experiences moments of relief, where the trembling of his hands ceases and his breathing becomes deep again. But this peace is a fragile illusion, for he has not yet realized that the cure is not in David's melody, but in the repentance he refuses to embrace. Saul's anomaly is the same as that of any man who tries to treat spiritual wounds with temporary anesthetics, seeking an entertainment or the talent of others, what could only be resolved in the presence of God. He loves the relief David brings, but soon he will begin to hate the anointing David carries, for the young man's light exposes the king's growing darkness. That decision to seek only external relief without treating the internal cause would change everything, preparing the ground for a paranoia that would turn the palace into a court of death. If this silence is finding a place in you, and you feel your soul needs a safe harbor, join us on this journey. Leave your mark of support and write in the comments this seal of commitment. I accept the rest. The glint of bronze from Saul's spear, which was once a symbol of protection for the nation, now reflects the torchlight in a distorted way, like the king's own judgment. The palace, a structure of cold stone and authority, It becomes too small for the wounded ego of a man who hears the songs of women in the streets of Israel, exalting David's victories above his own. The sound of voices shouting, "David has slain his 10,000s," penetrates Saul's pores like poison, transforming the relief the music brought into a stench of betrayal and a thirst for blood that cracks the ground of his conscience. Microscopically, the tremor in Saul's hand as he grips the wooden shaft of the spear reveals a silent decision about to be made. He watches David, the young man who used to calm him, and no longer sees a servant, but an existential threat that personifies everything he has lost: youth, courage, and above all, the audible favor of the Creator. The air in the room becomes thin, charged with the electricity of paranoia, as the king clenches his imperfect teeth and feels the taste of ash in his mouth, realizing that the silence of God is now filled by the deafening noise of his own insecurity. In a sudden, percussive movement, the spear flies, cutting the air with a hiss that announces the final break from normalcy and the beginning of a pursuit that would last years. David dodges, but the metallic tip drives into the wall with a dry thud, vibrating like Saul's heart, which at that moment realized something had begun to crumble beyond repair. He did not know it yet, but that attempted murder was a public confession that he would rather rule a graveyard than lose the throne to God's anointed. The heat in Nob is suffocating, a swelter that makes dust stick to the sweaty skin of the priests wearing their white linen ephods, now stained by terror. Saul arrives at this sacred city not as a protector, but as a wounded animal that sees betrayal in every gesture of hospitality. He glares at the high priest Ahimelech with eyes that have lost the spark of reason, replaced by a glassy coldness that ignores the holiness of the place. The smell of unleavened bread and incense in the air is suddenly cut by the metallic odor of fear, as the king demands to know why the son of Jesse received aid under that roof. Saul's anomaly reaches a new level of perversion when he orders his own soldiers to raise their swords against God's ministers. But even the most hardened warriors hesitate before the sacrilege. It is Doeg the Edomite, a foreigner with no reverence for the God of Israel, who steps forward. And the sound of metal cutting through flesh and linen echoes through the valley like a war cry against heaven itself. The blood of the 85 men who wore the ephod flows into the dry earth, creating a dark mud that marks the point of no return in the king's psyche. This spiritual autopsy reveals that by killing the priests, Saul was trying to assassinate the voice of his own conscience that still whispered about his fall. He destroys the city of Nob, women, children, and animals, in a frantic effort to silence any remaining connection with the divine. The king has not yet realized it, but every sword stroke against the sacred was one more nail in the coffin of his own sanity, transforming the silence of God into an irrevocable sentence of isolation. Saul's nights have become deserts of vigil, where the only sound is the crackling of wood burning in the embers and the whistling of the wind passing through the cracks of the rocks of Engedi. The king no longer sleeps the sleep of the righteous. His eyes, now deep-set and circled by dark rings, watch the darkness as if it hid the face of divine judgment itself. The skin on his arms is rough, marked by desert dust and the salt of sweat that never fully dries, while he leans over papyrus maps that no longer make sense. He pursues David among the crags of the wild goats, but the true hunt is happening inside his chest, where paranoia is the predator and his peace is the cornered prey. The gritty realism of this pursuit is revealed in the texture of the damp caves, where the smell of mold and limestone mixes with the heavy breath of exhausted soldiers who no longer understand their leader's obsession. Saul enters one of these crevices to relieve himself, stripped of his majesty by a basic human need, unaware that in the absolute gloom of that rock, only a few feet away is the man he wishes to destroy. The air inside is cold and heavy, and the silence is so thick the king can hear his own blood pulsing in his temples, unaware that the edge of a blade has just cut the hem of his royal robe as a silent warning that heaven has delivered him. David's decision to spare Saul's life, instead of bringing the king to repentance, only deepens the wound in his soul, for he realizes his enemy possesses the righteousness he himself sold for a handful of pride. The contrast between David's mercy and Saul's fury creates a short circuit in the monarch's mind, and he weeps bitter tears of a remorse that does not become change, but only another layer of weight upon his weary spirit. Something has begun to crumble in the last pillar of his dignity, and as he watches David from a distance, shouting about his innocence, Saul feels that the abyss between him and the light has become a distance no army can cross. The death of Samuel was not just the end of a man, but the closing of the last window through which the light of God entered Saul's life. The prophet's funeral in Ramah is described by the weight of the dry earth falling on the coffin, a thudding sound that echoes like the final beat of a heart that can no longer find its way. The air in Israel becomes stagnant, heavy with the smell of mourning and the dust of the crowds weeping for the loss of the nation's moral compass. While the people lament, Saul feels a chill in his bones that no royal robe can warm, realizing that now he is truly a king without a guide. At the macro level, the Philistine army moves like a tide of bronze and iron toward Shunem, an unstoppable force taking advantage of the vacuum of spiritual leadership to tighten the siege against Israel. At the micro level, we see Saul observing the horizon of his camp, his calloused hands gripping the hilt of his sword until his knuckles turn white, while he whispers questions to the wind that brings no answer. The prophetic silence is absolute. Dreams are but meaningless shadows. Even the Urim and Thummim, the sacred stones of consultation, remain cold and mute in the hands of the priests he has not yet killed. The anomaly here manifests in Saul's desperate attempt to force communication with the divine, when his own sin has erected a wall of bronze between earth and heaven. He walks among the tents of his soldiers, hearing the earth-shattering noise coming from the enemy camp, and feels that his crown is now a weight sinking him into the ground, rather than a symbol of elevation. Something has begun to crumble at the base of his courage, and the pressure of an iron sky over a head of clay pushes him toward a decision that would change everything and seal his fate in the shadows. The darkness surrounding the road to Endor is not just the absence of sun. It is a gloom that seems to have weight, a dampness that clings to Saul's tunic as he walks under a disguise that wounds his dignity. The king has stripped himself of his royal ornaments, exchanging fine linen for peasant rags, but the set of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands reveal that beneath the tatters, the heart of a desperate monarch still beats. The smell of wet earth and trampled grass mixes with the odor of fear exuding from his two companions, who look back at every crack of a dry twig, fearing both the Philistines and the judgment of heaven for what they are about to do. They arrive at the entrance of a cave where the air is stale, heavy with the aroma of burnt herbs and the stench of something slowly rotting in the dark. The woman who lives there, with skin tanned like old leather and eyes that seem to see through flesh, he represents the final threshold of Saul's apostasy. He, who once expelled the mediums from the land in obedience to the law, now bows before a mediator of shadows, begging for a crumb of information that the living God denied him. The visual contrast is brutal. The greatest man in Israel, huddled in a muddy corner, seeking in the underworld the direction he lost when he stopped bowing his knees before the altar. The tension reaches its peak when the medium asks, Whom shall I bring up for you?" The name Samuel leaves Saul's mouth like a gasp of agony, a desperate attempt to resurrect the past so as not to have to face the future. The anomaly here is complete. Saul does not want God. He wants the benefits of God's guidance, even if he must pact with what he himself condemned. As the woman begins her incantations and the shadows on the cave wall seem to lengthen and take on grotesque shapes, the king feels the ground beneath his feet is made of quicksand, and that the voice he so longs to hear may be the final nail in his destiny. The floor of the cave at Endor seems to vibrate at a low frequency, a hum that comes not from the ears, but from the center of Saul's soul. The cold emanating from the damp walls, where sludge trickles down like black tears, becomes suddenly gelid, an air that cuts through the chest and makes the king's breath form small clouds of vapor under the flickering light of a single oil lamp. The witch, whose hands now writhe like the roots of a dead tree, emits a guttural sound that does not belong to her throat, and the smell of sulfur and overturned earth fills the room. She's suffocating the aroma of leather and sweat from the disguised king. When the spectral figure of Samuel begins to emerge from the dense mist rising from the ground, Saul does not see just a prophet. He sees the mirror of his own destruction, wrapped in a mantle that seems woven from the shadows of his disobediences. The visual impact of that presence is devastating. Saul falls face down on the dirt floor, his fingers burying themselves in the mud as the weight of his invisible crown finally crushes his neck. Samuel does not speak with the sweetness of a mentor, but with the cutting precision of a celestial executioner. Every word that leaves the specter's mouth is like a hammer blow against a crystal anvil. "Why have you disturbed me?" The king, his face pressed against the dust, feels the bitter taste of belated regret, realizing that God's silence was, in truth, a mercy he had just violated. The prophet's voice details tomorrow with terrifying clarity, describing the battlefield of Gilboa, stained with the blood of his sons and the end of his lineage, while the witch watches from afar, huddled, seeing the most powerful man in the nation reduced to a heap of trembling flesh and dirty rags. Microscopically, we can observe Saul's pupil dilating until the brown of his eyes disappears into the absolute black of panic. The skin of his face, marked by years of sun and battles, now looks flaccid, losing the tone of authority. He cannot stand. His muscles, which once carried heavy armor, now refuse to obey his will, as if the earth itself were claiming his body ahead of time. Saul's anomaly reaches its climax here. He went seeking control over the future and received the death sentence of his legacy. The silence that follows the specter's disappearance is even worse than his words. It is a terminal silence, the sound of a door closing forever in the corridor of eternity. The woman, in a gesture of somber pity, offers him some food, but Saul looks at the bread as if it were ash, for he knows his last meal will not be that of a king, but of a condemned man, walking to his own slaughter under the cold light of the dawn, already breaking on the horizon of Endor. The light beginning to crawl over the peaks of Gilboa brings not the hope of a new day, but the relentless clarity of an open-air morgue. Saul watches the sun rise through the opening of the royal tent, his eyes burning from lack of sleep and the salt of tears that have dried over his sunken cheeks. The morning air is cold, heavy with the scent of dewy grass and the metallic odor of thousands of blades being sharpened in the Philistine camp, a rhythmic, dry sound that ticks like an execution clock. Every movement of the king is slow, almost underwater. He feels the weight of every piece of his bronze armor, as if they were links in a chain pulling him into the depths of the earth. Saul's hands, marked by scars of ancient wars and nails dirty from the dust of the cave at Endor, tremble as he tries to buckle the leather straps of his greaves. The leather creaks under his fingers, a sound that seems to echo the collapse of his own internal structure. He looks at his sword, the one that was once the terror of the Ammonites, and no longer sees an instrument of liberation, but a burden of cold iron that seems to denounce his loneliness. The silence of God has now materialized into physical paralysis. The king feels like a stranger inside his own body, an invader occupying a throne that no longer belongs to him, while cold sweat trickles down his temples, tracing gray paths on his pale skin. Microscopically, the gritty realism reveals the details of his physical decay. Imperfect teeth grinding against each other in an effort to maintain composure. The heavy breath of one who has eaten nothing but despair. And the dilated pores of a man who knows the ground beneath his feet is about to drink his blood. Saul's anomaly reaches an abyssal depth when he looks at his sons, Jonathan and Abinadab, preparing for battle. He sees in them the faces of the condemned, feeling the corrosive guilt of knowing that his spiritual collapse dragged the innocence of his lineage into the abyss. There are no more prayers, no more strategies. There is only the inertia of a giant walking toward the impact. Hope in the Philistine steel is faster than the voice of Samuel's ghost still screaming in his ears. The atmosphere of the camp is one of sepulchral silence, interrupted only by the nervous neighing of horses and the flapping wings of ravens already circling the valley, as if nature itself had smelled the death emanating from the king's tent. Saul walks out, and the sunlight reveals the fragility of his majesty, a man who possesses the army, but not the peace, who possesses the crown, but has lost the soul. He mounts his horse with a painful effort, feeling the saddle is a throne of thorns, and as the army takes its position, he realizes the greatest battle will not be against the bronze men in front of him, but against the deafening void that has pursued him since the spirit departed and left only the echo of who he could have been. What you are seeing is the portrait of a man who has an army but has lost his peace. If this spiritual autopsy of Saul's mind is revealing layers of your own walk that you never dared to face, know that you are not alone at this analysis table. So that we can continue to rescue these deep truths from the scriptures, I invite you to become an official part of our community. Subscribe to the Bible Teaches channel and share this video with someone you know is facing their own desert of silence. Let's carry this light forward. The sound of the Philistine advance at Gilboa is no ordinary noise. It is a continuous thunder rising from the ground, making small limestone pebbles dance under the hooves of Israelite horses. Saul feels this vibration in the soles of his boots, a resonance that seems to find the exact echo of the void in his chest. The enemy army appears on the horizon like a wall of polished bronze, reflecting a merciless sun that blinds Israel's archers. The smell of cedar oil used on enemy armor mixes with the stench of raw beef and old leather emanating from the ranks of mercenaries, creating an atmosphere where death can be smelled before the first blow. Saul raises his spear, but the weight of the metal seems to have tripled. He looks at his own hands and realizes the sweat mixed with dust has formed a gray crust that makes it hard to grip the wooden handle. The battle begins not with a shout, but with the deafening hiss of thousands of arrows that darken the sky for a moment, like a cloud of iron locusts. Saul hears the dry thud of metallic points piercing wooden shields in the soft flesh of the soldiers beside him. The gritty realism manifests in the cruelest details. The sound of bones breaking under the impact of chariots. The iron smell of fresh blood beginning to irrigate the dry grass of the mount. And the look of terror in the eyes of men seeking in their king a sign of hope he cannot give. Saul fights with a mechanical ferocity, striking at shadows and bodies with a strength born of despair, not courage. He is surrounded by a chaos that perfectly reflects the disorder of his mind. Every cry of agony from his men sounds like a direct accusation against his spiritual negligence. Microscopically, the king observes a shard of bronze embedded in the neck of one of his commanders, and for a second, time seems to freeze. He sees the pulse of life draining in rhythmic jets, while the dust of the battle enters his lungs, provoking a dry cough that tastes of blood and smoke. Saul's anomaly reaches a point of brutal awareness. He realizes that God is not there to save him, but neither is he there to destroy him. He has simply withdrawn, leaving Saul to the natural consequences of a world without divine protection. The king feels the cut of a Philistine blade tear the leather of his pauldron, a sharp pain that brings him back to the reality that his body of flesh is as vulnerable as any peasant's. He looks around and sees Jonathan fall, the son he so loved and so wounded, and the cry that leaves Saul's throat is the sound of a soul that has finally shattered into 1,000 pieces under the weight of a heaven that remains in absolute silence. The slope of Mount Gilboa has become a slide of red mud and scraps of linen. Saul walks among the bodies, his vision becoming blurred by extreme fatigue and the sweat trickling inside his helmet, stinging his eyes. He sees the bodies of Abinadab and Malchishua, his sons, fallen like young trees cut down before their time, and the image is a stab to his conscience that hurts more than any physical wound. The macro history of a dynasty that was meant to be eternal is being written in real time with the blood of his own lineage, and the king understands that Samuel's prophecy in Endor was not a threat, but a fait accompli he is now forced to witness, frame by frame. The gritty realism here focuses on the texture of defeat, the sound of flies already beginning to swarm over open wounds, the opaque glint in the eyes of the dead that seem to stare fixedly at Saul, and the weight of his royal cloak, now soaked in others' blood and mud, becoming an unbearable burden. Saul tries to cry out to God one last time, but his voice fails, sounding only like a dry hiss in a throat parched by thirst and dread. He feels the space around him shrinking. The Philistine archers have identified him, and the rain of arrows now focuses in his direction, each impact on his shield sending painful shockwaves through his exhausted arms. The anomaly is revealed in its totality. The man who began his journey, hidden by shyness, ends it exposed on the top of a mountain, being hunted like a wounded animal. Feeling the cold tip of an arrow pierce the gap between his armor plates, Saul staggers, the metal tearing through muscle tissue and hitting ribs with a muffled crack. He falls to his knees, not in prayer, but from physical incapacity, feeling the heat of his own blood trickling inside his tunic. A strangely comforting sensation, as if life were finally leaving the broken vessel of his ego. He looks at his armor-bearer, a young man whose teeth chatter with terror, and orders him to kill him. The request is the final act of a mind that refuses to accept humiliation at the hands of men, and even after accepting rejection at the hands of God. The silence that follows is interrupted only by Saul's heavy wheezing, a rhythmic sound that seems to count the final seconds of a reign that began with sacred oil and ends with the acrid smell of absolute defeat. The air at the summit of Gilboa is impregnated with the sweet, metallic smell of blood saturating the earth, turning the soil into a dark mud that sticks to the boots and knees of those still breathing. Saul, the man who was once the hope of a nation, is now huddled against a cold rock, feeling the vibration of arrows that still strike his discarded shield a few feet away. He stares at his armor-bearer, a young man whose face is covered in a patina of ash and sweat, and sees in him the reflection of his own ruin. Saul's request to be run through is not an act of martial courage, but the last gasp of an ego that prefers death to the judgment of men, a final attempt to control the uncontrollable. The gritty realism reveals itself in the uncontrollable trembling of the young armor-bearer's hands, gripping the hilt of his sword so tightly that the tendons in his forearms seem ready to snap the leather of his bracers. He looks at the king, and what he sees is no longer the chosen of God, but a broken monument, a giant whose foundations were devoured by silence. The sound of Saul's labored breathing, mixed with the gurgle of blood in his wounded lungs, is the only noise cutting through the static tension of that moment. The young man recoils, his eyes dilated by the sacred horror of raising a hand against the anointed, even if that anointed is now just a carcass of lost glory. The armor-bearer's refusal is the final blow to Saul's authority. He is no longer obeyed even by the one who swore to give his life for him. Faced with the vacuum of loyalty and the proximity of Philistine footsteps already ascending the slope with shouts of triumph that tear through the wind, Saul makes the decision that would seal his legend in the shadows. He positions the hilt of his own sword against the rocky ground, feeling the metallic tip find the opening in his tunic just below the sternum. The metal is cold, a violent contrast to the feverish heat consuming his body. Microscopically, we can feel the pressure of the steel against the skin, the second of hesitation where Saul's entire life, from the lost donkeys to Samuel's oil, passes before his eyes like a trail of smoke. With a groan, carrying the weight of decades of resistance to God, he throws himself onto the blade. The sound is a dull thud, the noise of metal penetrating tissue and organs, followed by the deepest silence Saul has ever experienced. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of the end. The armor-bearer, seeing his lord's body writhe and finally go still over his own weapon, is seized by a sudden madness and imitates the gesture, joining his destiny to the vacuum left by the king. When the Philistines find Saul's body the next day, the sun has already begun to accelerate the process of decomposing Israel's glory. The king's corpse is rigid, pinned to the sword he chose as his final companion, his eyes fixed on a sky he could not decipher. The gritty realism focuses on the brutal detail of the desecration. The enemy soldiers, with their braided beards and smelling of cheap wine and triumph, approach the body with a cruel reverence. They do not see a man, they see a symbol that needs to be dismembered for their victory to be complete. The sound of metal cutting through the bones of Saul's neck echoes through the deserted valley as a warning that, without the protection of the divine, man is but flesh at the mercy of dogs. Saul's head, which once bore the golden crown and prophetic unction, is raised like a macabre trophy, its hair tangled with blood and dust swaying in the wind as it is carried to be displayed in the temples of Dagon. The body, stripped of its bronze armor, which is taken as spoil to the temple of Ashtaroth, is pinned to the walls of Beth-Shan, exposed to public shame and the appetite of birds of prey. Microscopically, the narrative observes the king's skin turning dark under the inclement sun, the flies that respect no royal lineage, and the wind fluttering the torn garments of what was once the first monarch of a holy people. Saul's anomaly reaches its lowest point, the total exposure of the vulnerability of one who tried to be God of himself. This spiritual autopsy of Saul's end reveals the tragedy of human autonomy. The man who could not bear God's silence is now transformed into a mute spectacle for his enemies. As the news of Saul's death runs through the villages of Israel, bringing with it the scent of fear and the smoke of burning houses, the spiritual vacuum he left becomes an open wound in the nation. The palace of Gibeah is empty. The torches are extinguished, and the only sound that remains is the echo of an anomaly that will serve as a warning for all generations. When man expels the voice of the Creator, he invites the deafening noise of his own destruction. The body hanging on the wall is the final image of a life that had everything but the only thing that mattered, the obedience that keeps heaven open. The news that Saul's body and those of his sons were exposed like useless carcasses on the walls of Beth-shan crosses the Jordan like a cry of horror that finds no echo in the mountains. In Jabesh-Gilead, the mood is one of bitter gratitude. The men of the city, warriors with skin tanned by the desert sun and hands calloused by the sword's hilt, remember a time when Saul was young and the oil still shone on his face. They remember the day he saved them from having their right eyes gouged out by Nahash the Ammonite. The gritty realism manifests in the detail of the preparations, the sound of metal being muffled so as not to clink in the night, the smell of tallow used to grease sandals and silence footsteps, and the heavy breathing of men who know they are entering the jaws of the Philistine wolf to rescue what remains of their king. They walk all night, a silent march under a moonless sky, where every shadow among the acacias looks like an enemy patrol. The air near Beth-shan is stagnant, heavy with the stench of decay emanating from the high walls, where birds of prey fight over scraps of flesh in the gloom. Microscopically, the scene is one of absolute rawness. The valiant men of Jabesh-Gilead climb the damp, slippery stone, feeling disgust and reverence struggle in their stomachs as they detach the rigid and disfigured bodies from the wooden beams. The sound of nails being pulled from dry flesh and bone echoes like a necessary sacrilege, as they wrap the royal remains in thick linen cloaks to stifle the odor of death and the gleam of exposed bone. This rescue mission is the final autopsy of human loyalty in a world that has already forgotten Saul. They carry the bodies back for miles, feeling the dead weight of a dynasty that failed, but which they refuse to leave as fodder for the dogs. When they arrive at Jabesh, there are no trumpets or parades. There is only the crackling of flames from a funeral pyre. The smell of burning flesh and oak wood fills the morning air, a dense smoke rising to the sky, like the final report of a stained rain. They bury the ashes under a tamarisk tree, a tree of persistent shadow, and fast for 7 days. Saul's anomaly ends here, between the fire that purifies and the earth that silences, proving that even when God is silent and the mind collapses, the memory of an old act of kindness can be the only thing that prevents a man from being totally erased from history. While Saul's ashes cool under the tamarisk of Jabesh, hundreds of miles away in Ziklag, the news hits David like a physical blow that takes his breath away. The man who was hunted like an animal, who lived in caves and slept with the smell of fear in his clothes because of Saul's paranoia, does not react with the expected triumph of a survivor. The gritty realism focuses on David's visceral reaction, the sound of fine fabric being torn in a gesture of desperate mourning, the glint of tears opening furrows in the dust of his face, and the weight of a silence he now shares with the empty throne. David does not see the death of an enemy. He sees the eclipse of an era and the tragic end of a man he, despite everything, still called the Lord's anointed. Microscopically, we can observe David holding the harp, But his fingers do not seek the melodies of relief that once calmed Saul's outbursts. Instead, he composes a lament that smells of blood and lost glory. The Song of the Bow is an emotional autopsy of the fall, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. David describes Saul and Jonathan as swifter than eagles and stronger than lions, deliberately ignoring the paranoia, the thrown spear, and the massacre at Nob. Saul's anomaly is here reinterpreted through the lens of grace. David chooses to remember the original majesty, not the final decrepitude. The smell of earth wet by the rain of tears and the sound of the sobs of David's men create a macroscopic contrast with the Philistine chaos still celebrating victory in the plains. This transition reveals the spiritual cost of inheriting a kingdom built on psychological ruins. David knows that the silence of God that consumed Saul is an abyss he himself will have to avoid at every step of his walk. The vacuum left by Saul is not just political, it is a national trauma that needs healing. The narrative shows us that the collapse of a mind does not affect only the individual, but alters the DNA of an entire culture. As David raises his eyes to the horizon of Judah, he feels the weight of the crown to come, not as a trophy of gold, but as a commitment never to let his own heart become a desert where the Creator's voice can no longer be heard. Saul's reign ends in ashes, but David's mourning is the fertilizer for the hope Israel now desperately seeks. David weeps for the one who hunted him. This is what the presence of God does to a human heart. But now, I need you to stop for a second and look at your own heart. Have you ever felt that the heavens have become as bronze? That your prayers hit the ceiling and come back as empty echoes? What we are going to dissect next is the most important part of this documentary, the spiritual science behind abandonment and how to not let God's silence become your ruin. Stay with us for the final minutes, for the answer to your peace may lie in the final autopsy we perform now. Getty Images, Explorer. To understand Saul's anomaly, we must dive into the physiology of his despair. What the scriptures call an evil spirit from the Lord manifests in the physical plane as a total dysregulation of the limbic system. Imagine the brain of a king living in a state of perpetual alert. Cortisol floods his veins like a silent poison, preventing restorative sleep and turning every shadow in the corner of the room into an assassin lying in wait. God's silence was not just a theological punishment. It was the removal of the psychic anchor that kept Saul sane. Without the Creator's voice to validate his identity, Saul became a castaway in a sea of distorted mirrors, where the only image he saw was that of his own obsolescence. The gritty realism of this condition is visible in the texture of his daily decay, lips cracked by the dehydration of anxiety, the fine tremor in the hands that once held the reins of a kingdom, and the inability to maintain focus in a simple conversation without his eyes wandering to the door, expecting betrayal. Christian psychology teaches us that the fear of divine abandonment is the root of all human paranoias. Saul tried to fill the void left by the Spirit with the approval of the people, with the glint of bronze, and with the blood of the priests. But every attempt was like drinking salt water to quench thirst. The spiritual vacuum is a black hole that consumes the personality. It sucks away joy, logic, and finally, the very will to live. Microscopically, we can analyze the moment David's envy becomes a pathology. It wasn't just about a stone throne in Jerusalem. It was about the light David carried, a light Saul recognized because he once had it. Saul's hatred for David was, in fact, a hatred for his own lost version. Every time he saw the young shepherd, he was reminded of the smell of fresh oil and the peace that was now foreign to him. This pain is what generates defensive aggression. Saul attacked so as not to have to feel the weight of his own vacuum. The visceral lesson here is that mental health and spiritual health are intertwined by invisible threads. When Saul cut the thread of obedience, the structure of his mind collapsed under the gravity of his own ego, leaving behind only the ruins of a man who tried to be king without being a servant. And there is a specific loneliness that only the powerful who have lost their unction know, the loneliness of a crowded stage. Saul continued to perform ceremonies, judge cases, and lead armies, but inside, he was a desert of echoes. The gritty realism of this staging is revealed in the details of the royal robes, which, though sumptuous on the outside, hid skin irritated by sweat and lack of bathing, a body wasting away while the crown remained gleaming. The king became a master in the art of appearance, but the mask of authority was cracking. The sound of his laughter at banquets was dry, lifeless, like the snapping of dead twigs underfoot, and his most intimate servants looked away when they saw him talking to himself in the dark corridors of Gibeah. At the macro level, the kingdom of Israel felt this instability. The borders seemed more porous, the soldiers' morale dropped like the temperature at nightfall, and the people began to whisper about the spirit that torments the king. Saul's anomaly affected the nation's climate. The leader's fear became the people's fear. Saul tried to compensate for his lack of spiritual authority with an increase in brute force, a common characteristic of regimes and minds in collapse. He no longer ruled by respect, but by dread, and dread is a foundation of quicksand. Microscopically, we see the king gripping the handle of the cedar throne until his nails turn purple, trying to hold on to a reality that has already slipped through his fingers like smoke. The autopsy of this period reveals that Saul was living what many of us face today: hollow success. It is the life that looks functional to those on the outside, but is a graveyard of purpose for the one living it. God's silence was the response to the silence of Saul's heart toward repentance. He asked God to deliver him from the Philistines, but he did not ask God to deliver him from himself. This refusal to face his own darkness is what turned his anomaly into a terminal tragedy. While he observed the stars over the territory of Israel, he no longer saw the promise of Abraham. He saw only points of cold light that reminded him how far he was from home, even while sitting on the highest throne in the land. The corridor leading to Saul's quarters in Gibeah became a tunnel of echoes and paranoia. The king can no longer distinguish the sound of the wind in the cracks of the stone windows from the whisper of invisible conspirators. The gritty realism focuses on the degraded environment. The torches burn unevenly, releasing a black smoke that stains the ceiling, and the floor is covered with scraps of food and sour wine that Saul, in his fits of rage, threw against the walls. He sits on the floor, his back against the cold throne, and bites the dry skin off his lips with his teeth, a nervous tick revealing the collapse of his psychological barrier. God's silence is a sensory torture. Saul feels as if the air is being sucked out of the room, leaving him in a vacuum chamber where only his sins scream. Saul's anomaly now manifests as a dissociation from reality. He looks at his hands and no longer sees the man who defeated the Ammonites, but an imposter wearing the skin of a king. Microscopically, we can observe the tremor in his eyelashes and the dilation of his pores when he hears David's name. The mention of his successor acts like an electric shock to his nervous system, triggering a fight-or-flight response that has nowhere to go. He is trapped in a mental labyrinth where all the exits have been walled up by his own disobedience. The psychology of abandonment here is deep. Saul fears not just losing the kingdom, he fears the disappearance of his own essence. Without the divine connection, he feels he is becoming transparent, a shadow that fades even before the sun sets. The smell of mold from the old tapestries and the metallic odor of his spear, always within reach, create an atmosphere of enclosure. Saul begins to experience auditory hallucinations, where Samuel's voice, heavy with judgment, seems to come from behind the linen curtains. He attacks the nothingness, striking at the air with a blunt sword, while his guards watch from the door with a mixture of pity and terror. The spiritual autopsy of this moment shows us that the human mind was not designed to carry the weight of sovereignty without the support of transcendence. When Saul expelled the Creator from his council, he condemned his brain to an infinite processing of threats that cannot be resolved with earthly weapons. He is a king in checkmate, playing against his own reflection on a board of broken stones. Saul's fall was not a sudden event, but a slow and persistent erosion of small no's said to the voice of conscience. The gritty realism now takes us into the interior of his wounded soul, where memories of his youth in Bethlehem, the smell of the earth after rain, and the sound of his father's donkeys seem to belong to someone else, a stranger who died long ago. Saul tries to reconstruct his narrative, justifying his errors as strategic necessities, but the lie does not heal the wound. It only hides it under a crust of pride that becomes more inflamed every day. God's silence is the definitive answer for the one who stopped listening. It's not that God became mute, it's that Saul became deaf to everything that was not the echo of his own will. In this final autopsy, we observe Saul's anomaly as a warning to all who seek the divine only as a utility of power. Saul wanted God's support, but not God's will. He wanted military victory, but not the transformation of character. Microscopically, we see the tension in his neck, muscles rigid as bowstrings ready to snap, symbolizing the stress of a life lived in opposition to the original purpose. The cost of this resistance is the fragmentation of identity. Saul ends his life seeking a witch because he no longer knows who he is without the label of chosen. The man who began with a new heart ends with a heart of stone, cracked by the pressure of trying to hold up the sky with hands of clay. The narrative atmosphere becomes dense, like the fog descending over Mount Gilboa before the final battle. The viewer is invited to look at their own evil spirits, the anxieties, the envies, and the silences we cultivate when we distance ourselves from the source. Saul's story is a dark mirror reflecting the danger of a life without an altar, the rhythmic sound of a hammer hitting a nail in the distance. Preparing the city's defenses sounds like the countdown to the end of an era. Saul looks at the horizon one last time, and the light of the setting sun gilds his armor, but does not warm his soul. He is the living monument to the fact that the greatest human tragedy is not dying, but living long enough to become the executioner of your own peace. The ashes under the tamarisk tree of Jabesh-Gilead have finally cooled, and the desert wind begins to scatter what remains of the first king of Israel across the dunes of time. But Saul's anomaly remains like a scar in biblical memory, a visceral reminder that the connection to the divine is not an accessory, but the oxygen of sanity. The gritty realism ends with the image of a new harp sounding in Jerusalem, David's, but the echo of Saul's spear still vibrates in the walls of human palaces. And the smell of incense in the new tabernacle tries to erase the odor of blood from Gilboa, but the lesson is carved in stone. God's silence is the loudest noise a man can hear, and it demands an answer that Saul never had the courage to give. Microscopically, the video ends with a close-up on the dry earth where Saul fell, A small plant begins to sprout between the cracks of the iron-stained rock, symbolizing that even from the tragedy of the anomaly, God cultivates learning for those who will come after. The viewer feels the weight of silence in their own room, a stillness that is no longer frightening, but an invitation to recalibrate the route. Saul's story was not told to terrify us with abandonment, but to draw us back to the presence. The king who lost God's voice teaches us, through his collapse, ain't to value the whisper we still have today. The journey ends where ours must begin, in the recognition that total autonomy is the darkest prison there is. As the screen darkens and the sound of David's harp becomes a single, prolonged note, the question hanging in the air is the final autopsy of your own heart. Are you hearing the whisper, or are you waiting for the silence to become a scream? Saul's anomaly is the vacuum that only the Spirit can fill, and as the lights go out, the echo of Gilboa reminds us that the heaviest crown is the one we try to carry alone.